Perfect. So today we're speaking with Eric Zimmerman, a game designer and professor of game design at NYU's Tisch School of the Arts. He has designed video games and tabletop games, and his teaching and writings have covered both creative processes and game design specifically. His most recent book, The Rules We Break: Lessons in Play, Thinking, and Design, was recently published in 2022. So our first couple of questions for you will be about your most recent book.
Great.
We understand why it's called Lessons in Play and Design, but why is it about lessons in thinking? Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Sure. Well, thanks, Kat. And I'm really happy to be here. Thanks for all the great questions, everybody. And I am super happy to talk with you all about my work, I guess, specifically writing. So here's the book that we're talking about, The Rules We Break. And I think that you're talking about the sort of the subtitle, Lessons in Play, Thinking, and Design. I guess it's a good question and really gets to the heart of what the book is about. When I first started, sorry if I'm going to give very long-winded answers to these very good questions, but
Take your time.
the when I first started out as a game designer in the industry, I guess earlier in my writing, I was really trying to think about what game design was as a field. And I know that games are like a huge industry, and it may seem like there's so much attention to them, and there's, people now getting degrees in them and taking classes and all these books coming out. But when I got started in the game industry in the 1990s, it really wasn't the case. And a lot of my early writing was thinking about if game design were a field like the way we think about architecture as a design field or dance as a field, Kat, what you were originally studying before you went into
Mhm.
philosophy, there's all kinds of isms and schools of thought and histories and competing ideas about what dance should be. But game design, it really wasn't like that when I entered the game industry. Didn't
Mhm.
feel like a discipline in that way. However, I guess I'm just saying this to set up the idea that most things have kind of shifted for me. So early on, I had a very kind of inward looking focus. Okay, how should game designers understand what they do and talk about it amongst themselves? But this book is really my attempt to sort of turn that all inside out. And so rather than being focused specifically for game designers to understand what games are, this is really me trying to share what I think is interesting and special about games with people that are outside the field. So that's specifically why I think I'm just trying to cast a really wide net and say, this is not necessarily about play or even about design. It's really about thinking. And my feeling is that games and game design and game-like thinking and playful ways of being and ways of approaching problem solving are relevant and have relevance in culture and in fields and professions that aren't necessarily specifically focused on games. So that's my hope is that there are things that are valuable about the way game designers approach communication and collaboration and problem solving that are useful outside of games. Am I answering the question?
Yeah, absolutely. To that point, like that's a very fascinating entry point into this kind of project. And on that note, how do you plan and how do you scope a project that, on the one hand, doesn't really feel to have a precedent as the way you're describing it? So, what are you looking to for sources, for models, inspirations, and then how do you kind of control your creative process to produce a cohesive product at the end?
Mm. And you're talking about the book specifically.
The book specifically, this question could also very
Right,
clearly apply to other games you've designed or the projects that you've been
right.
involved in.
Well, I think that yeah, so it's a really good point. I think that I'll put it this way. As a game designer, my core methodology is prototyping and playtesting and iteration. So iterative design just means that you create successive versions or iterations of the thing, and then you play test them. You have people actually interact with them, and you base your next set of decisions about how this thing that I'm working on should evolve based on what happens when you play test it. And of course, in dance, there's rehearsals. If you're writing, you're making drafts. But I think that in games, particularly, um, it's required that you have an iterative process, because while a set of words on a page definitely are a system, people can interpret them, in different ways. With a game, it's almost like you're making a machine. Like, oh my gosh, I didn't realize whoever moves first is going to win the game. It's just unbalanced that way. So how do we fix this kind of the balance of the whole system so that people have a more equal shot at winning, if that's what our game is about? And so this idea of prototyping and playtesting is kind of at the center of what I do. So definitely for games. For and that's contrasted with kind of like, I came from an art making background, and often sometimes artists, you go in your studio and you're working on artwork, and you develop a bunch of work, and then you bring it to a gallery maybe and have a show, for example.
Mhm.
And it's, you might have some people over to give you feedback, but mostly you're kind of producing work and then you're kind of presenting the end result. And for me as a designer, I have a sort of the opposite approach, which is like, get something in front of people as quickly as possible and see how they react with it, see how they use it, and figure out how to make it better. So I definitely had that approach when I was writing this book. And so on the one hand, I prototyped and play tested this book on a lot of different levels. We can talk about it. I did it with the cover design. I did it with the content of the book. I did it with the structure of each chapter. But on the other hand, the content of the book, the main content of the book, was actually uh, teaching exercises that I have been doing for many, many years. So the structure of the book is that there's three main structures: systems, play. This is just going to the inside of the book: systems, play, and design. So this is systems and design, and this is the section on play. This is just a table of contents. And then each section, this is the play section, has these little mini essays, one-page essays, but the bulk of the book are these exercises, actual things that you can do. So here you can see their physical play and playing with meaning and social play. So those exercises, these are all things that I already have been doing. So on one hand, I was generating this book, but on the other hand, this book is documentation. So this is based on my teaching practice that I've been doing for many years. And again, your first question kind of got at that, like, why am I making this book? Because I feel, oh, I've been doing this weird thing, which is I've been teaching game design for decades. I just got in very early teaching, and I realized I have all of these sort of exercises and tricks and games that I play with people, ways of structuring assignments, approaches to how you give critique, for example, that I just wanted to share with other people. So that's what this book is about. But I could go into more detail about exactly what that process was like if you want, Kat. I don't know if that's where you were going with the question. It's a really big question that you're really asking me about what's my writing process. So I can keep going, or if there was something more specific that you wanted to ask about.
I mean, I can clarify, I think, where like the question is coming from like my perspective, but I also think a more
Mhm.
general student perspective. Because I know starting a project or committing to a project or really scoping that beginning is always this very intimidating first step. You
Right.
get procrastination on that first draft, and like once you get started, it's fine, but it's the getting started part that's always really hard. And you answered this a little bit with like the iterative process where you put something together and you throw it out there and you see what happens. Like that
Mm,
is a huge method of generating feedback that,
right.
at least in my experience, is largely absent from the student experience. You kind of put
Ah,
together and then you cobble a final thing and then you present that final thing, very much the
right.
studio gallery experience.
Right.
Um,
Right. And
and
with
so,
the student version, that you're like cramming the night before to just kind of get something on the page and get it out there. And it's really true. And when I have assignments in classes that I give, whether it's writing or whether it's a game, I realize that's the case. So I have to really basically try and teach students this process by saying, okay, when you come in, let's say they have a month to work on a project. Every week they're bringing in something. So at the first week, it might just be an outline. The second week, it might be a full introduction and a little more details. On the third week, it's a full draft, and you're going to have, and each time we actually print them out, we put them on a table, and people are picking them up and reading it, giving each other feedback. So if you didn't do it, you're kind of like, oh, I missed out on getting feedback. But really forcing people to iterate, and figuring out what that's going to be. But sorry, maybe I jumped on the end of your question there. Um, the
No, all
I
good. Yeah.
I do think that uh, I think that there's, I don't think that there's one size fits all for creative process. And sometimes I think about it that, especially for something like a book like this, sometimes there's a bottom up process and sometimes there's a top down process. And I do both. And sometimes I switch between them. So a bottom up process for this book would be, you know what, I'm just going to like take some of these exercises that I've been doing informally for years in my classes, and I'm going to write it up. What does it mean to kind of write it up? And the thing I'm writing might end up being in the middle of the book. It might be like a scene in a narrative if you're doing a narrative, but I just want to get something on paper. That's bottom up. Just like diving in. Here's a thing I think will probably end up in the final thing. Let me just do a version of it. Top down is more like structuring, right? Like, okay, what's the table of contents? What does this look like? What's it going to be? And I did both. So I think in developing this book, I switched between the two, and it feels very different, right? Bottom up, doing stuff bottom up, it's more intuitive. Like you're really kneading the dough, you're getting your hands dirty, you're working with words and language. And top down is like, okay, I'm going to really think about this from a structural point of view, and sort of be more like the architect, dealing with the blueprint. Like, what are the parts of this? How are they going to fit together? And the thing that ties it together is, that you have ideas you're exploring. Are the ideas coming up in the right way, both bottom up and top down? And you're also creating an experience. So I think that's also, for me, something that ties these books and game design, is that I'm always thinking about the audience. So I'm always thinking about what's it going to be like when you turn the page, or when you read this thing and then that thing, or is this, in this case, it's very modular system. So it's more like a recipe book. So each thing kind of needs to stand on its own. So what is the experience that you're trying to provide for the audience? And that for me is kind of the thread that can tie together this kind of bottom up and top down approaches.
That's fantastic. Yeah, the clarifications are super helpful, especially defining terms. But on that last note, kind of how do you know that this idea that to you is very appealing and interesting, is something that other people are also going to be interested in? It's a specifically a student question. Like, how do you know that whatever you're working on isn't just a personal project that's only interesting to you?
Right. I think that's a great question. And that's where you really, that's where testing comes in really handy. And so when I say testing and play testing, it can mean a lot of different things, but it really means getting the experience in front of other people and seeing how they react and dialoguing with them about it. So one of the things that I did when I started working on this book, The Rules We Break, like I said, the heart of this book is a bunch of exercises. I think there's 24 in here. And I wrote them up in a format that I thought someone who's not me could actually use them. I put them in Dropbox on a folder, and I wrote to about 20 different colleagues of mine. Some were in games, some were out of games, that are all educators, that I thought, here's someone that, in the past they said that they would be interested in this, or that might be teaching similar things or teaching different things. And I basically had a large email list, and I invited people to play the exercises and give me feedback. So I really, basically gave them access to an early manuscript, and then asked people to try them out. And I think this is one of the things about, if you're into this idea of iteration and process, you can get a little bit annoying, because you always have some prototype or project that you're working on, and that you're trying to get feedback from people. I've been told, I have friends that throw parties, and they've said, everyone is welcome, but Eric, please don't bring any of your board game prototypes to the party, right? Because they'll know that I'll show up with like, oh, it's a social gathering. Hey, everyone, want to try my game? So I think that it can help to be shameless like that sometimes. But in this case, I really, contacted people, and I said, hey, if you're interested in helping me out, I would love to get your feedback. And a lot of, not everyone it fit into what they were doing, but many of them tried out the exercises and gave me good feedback both on the content and the focus and the flow of the exercise. So that was one very important way that I play tested the book. And then that, just to answer your question, that's what helps me understand. I mean, that's, I feel like, when you're making a piece of art or design or an experience for someone, in the end, I think that the reactions that you get and the connection that you might have with an audience is really what matters. And I feel like for me, those moments of playtesting, which can be terrifying because what you've made is kind of half finished and probably broken and not really, you know, totally up to where it's going to be at the end of the process. But the only way to really make it better is to put it in front of other people and get their feedback. So sometimes your best ideas kind of, crash on the hard rocks of reality, and you realize, wow, that thing that I thought was a great idea, nobody likes it. But then there's this other thing that everyone is responding to. So maybe I actually can shift focus a little bit and bring that out. So um, for me, it's observing people's genuine responses and then dialoguing with them about it. Um, so that happened on the level of using the exercises. It also happened in my collaboration with an editor at the press. Once I had, we could talk about that. There was a whole different process of getting a proposal together and sending it to a publisher, collaborating with the designer, the graphic designer of the book, and even having circles of friends. I belong to a reading group and we read books, but sometimes we read each other's manuscripts. So I actually had them read selected sections of the book as well and give me detailed feedback. So really strategizing how I can get the feedback I need on certain points was really important.
Yeah, kind of follow-up question on the whole feedback process is like you
Mm-hmm.
mentioned having like lists of colleagues that you can reach out to and having like reading groups that you can connect with. Do you have any like recommendations or suggestions for how to begin to form those kinds of connections if you're very much kind of an isolated academic? And then how do you really start to build up that social circle that can then provide sort of feedback and connection and a reality check sometimes on the work that we're
Right.
doing?
Um, Gosh, it's funny. The reading group that I mentioned was formed during the pandemic because we were sort of all friends that we weren't going to see each other because we were all in separate places, and we decided to get together and start reading. So that was sort of fortuitous that way. But I think that if you're in a situation and you're a creative person or a researcher, whether you're doing academic writing or narrative writing or screenwriting, whatever it is, and you want to get feedback from other people, likely there's plenty of other people that are in the same situation. That if you said, hey, what if we had a group where we just kind of experienced each other's work, gave each other feedback, supported each other, probably you would find, probably people would say, wow, that's a great idea. I'm in, or I'll try it out. Right. So I, I think that for me, it was really just, like I said, I'm a little bit shameless in instrumentalizing my friendships and social networks for this purpose. But, I think whether it's online, my reading group meets over Zoom regularly, but, or other kinds of, tabletop playtesting can happen now virtually through certain platforms or in person. And I'll just give you one other example. There's often communities at the NYU Game Center for interactive projects. We have a weekly playtest Thursdays that's open to any NYU person or even the public. So you can just show up and play other people's games. You can bring a game of your own and have it playtested by other people that are there, tabletop games or video games. So I think finding those communities of interest can be key.
Fantastic. I appreciate very concrete feedback, especially like knowing what resources NYU has to offer that can often be a game
Mm.
changer. They're hard to find. NYU's massive, but it's good to know that they're there. A little bit more about kind of the the feedback process and like incorporating what people are kind of
Mm.
the reactions they have, the feedback they're giving you. How long does it take you to get to your final draft? Like you've mentioned that you consult pretty much everyone you can get your hands on, but do you kind of reach out to other disciplines, people who are maybe very unfamiliar with your work? If you're writing about something that's more ideological, maybe people who would disagree
Mm.
with your work on first pass, kind
Right.
of how far do
Right.
you cast that net, and how long do you keep that net cast? Like how long do you keep accumulating feedback until you really settle down on this is what I'm going to do and this is how it's going to be done?
Right. I would put it this way. It's a really good question, and it's so great that you're asking about process because I'm all about process. I feel like when you get to the end of something like this, this is the hard part about design or really doing anything that's creative. In the end, we just have like the final product. Like it could be a book like this. It could be a cup. Here's what I'm drinking my coffee out of right now. Like this is a final thing too. But this is really just the residue of a process of a bunch of people making decisions, changing things, balancing, the material constraints and the economic constraints, ergonomics, the aesthetics, the weight, who is this for, who can afford it, how durable is it, how does it stack, how does it ship, um, that it's not toxic, like all of these different considerations. So in terms of and so the end result is really the residue of a process. And so this is why it's great that you're asking me all these good questions about the process, because I feel that often people get really you really all you see, like if you love books, all you see are books in the end. But you really would be well served by thinking about, well, rather than like, oh, my thing should look like this, or in the end it's going to be like this. Sometimes it's just about how do I take the next step? What's the next step forward that I'm going to move in the process? And I feel like sometimes to me, the timeline feels like like sort of a cone, right? So here at the beginning of the process, the decisions that you're making are very big. Am I going to write a book? Am I going to compose a dance? Am I going to, is it going to be fiction or nonfiction? It's totally open-ended, right? But as you start working on something, you sort of start narrowing it down. Okay, I definitely want to write a book. It's going to be nonfiction. I want to make it autobiographical, right? So sort of like, and so in the middle, then you're making decisions about what's the content, how's it structured. Maybe you're doing some bottom up and some top down. And then by the end of that process, the decisions that you're making are much smaller. You're like doing final editing and proofing, right? And so you sort of move from this very general decisions about the overall concept to the final, like in a game, it might be, bug fixing or final editing or proofing the materials. Um, um, and I guess my answer to your question about how you work with and who you work with, it depends where you are in the process, right? So in the beginning, you might be just bouncing the idea off of, what do you think about this book? I'm thinking about this, right? In the middle, you might be showing people outlines or small sections, and then in the end, you might have a full draft. And I'll give you an example. The reading group of people that I mentioned, none of them are game designers. They're academics, but they're in other fields, in history, in business, in sociology, in religious studies, or comparative religion, I should say. So 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 they were interesting, and I thought, you know what, it's I'll give them an exercise or two, but actually, this is a really good group to give me feedback on those little mini essays, right? I mentioned that there's exercises, but then there's also these one-page essays, and this is more like content. And I thought, well, this is a good place for people to tell me, like, what do you think of these actual ideas that I am sort of putting forward in this book? Um, but I also gave them the exercises too. And I didn't give them everything. Like I had to think about, okay, like what are the things that I'm most unsure about? I'm going to sort of have them read it and give me feedback. But they gave me great feedback. And I'll give you an example. There's a lot of physical games in the book. So some of the exercises are playground style physical games. Now, if I had a bunch of game people read it, they generally going to be, oh, gung ho, yeah, let's play hard, let's jump in there. And a couple of the people in the reading group they're not game people, which was so valuable. And basically, this person said, I'm the kind of person where this is happening, and I would not want to participate, or I would not feel comfortable participating, or I might not, like what does it mean? Like, how are you making these accessible for people that want to participate at different levels? And it's such a good point. And it's also, part of the way that I actually run the exercises, but not something that I had put into the book. So now when I am introducing this idea of physical play and exercises, I talk about, for example, the fact that you should never force people to play. If you're forcing people to play, it's not play, it's, I don't know, work or like a labor camp or something, right? It's not something, it's more like a punishment. So you should never force anyone to play. If they want to just watch, it's totally fine. Maybe there's other roles for them. They can be spectators, they can be referees. And actually being on the outside of a game gives you kind of interesting, sharp eyes to observe from a different perspective what everyone is doing. On the other hand, there's also all kinds of guidelines for changing and modifying games, physical games, to make them more accessible to a wider audience. And that itself is an interesting design lesson. So I wouldn't have gotten that kind of feedback unless I had kind of had people from the outside reading sections of the book and talking to me about it. So I think that you will kind of want both. Like, you want people that are more knowledgeable in the field and experts and well-read, but you also want people from the outside. And in this case, just to go back to your very first question, like the idea of the thinking is like, oh, this is relevant to people that are not just game people. Then I need, if that's what I really believe, I need those people reading the draft and giving me feedback.
Absolutely. On that point, though, when you're getting this feedback, say somebody gives you feedback and like, this absolutely doesn't work. How do you come to the decision that something needs to be cut? How do you cope with cutting something that you really want to keep but just isn't working? Like, do you hold that idea for a later project? Do you try to rework it and fit it into this one? Kind of, what's your process with general like cutting stuff in the project?
Right. That's a really good question. First of all, you always have to ask yourself the question that when someone is giving you feedback on something, in the end, you're the expert of the thing you're making, right? So they're the patient and you're the doctor, right? You have to always take their feedback as a symptom of something. So if somebody says, oh, like, I think that this character should do this, in the opening chapter, you don't necessarily have to take their exact suggestion, but you might say, well, why? Why do you think that? And then they might tell you, well, because I was bored in the first chapter. And then you're like, oh, that's interesting. Okay, that's the issue. The issue is not, did character do X or Y? The issue is they're not bored enough to get to chapter 2. I mean, sorry, they're not interested enough to get to chapter 2. So I'm going to take their problem, but I'm not going to take their solution. And I think that's one thing to always remember, is that you always have to interpret the feedback and think about how do I address their concerns, or how do I address, or not, right? Because not everything has to appeal to every person. And that is the danger of playtesting, is that you don't ever want to feel like everybody has to like everything, because you can end up watering something down and kind of ironing the quirkiness out of something, right? So you have to be careful if you're doing a lot of testing and showing projects to people early on. But again, like I said, I'm very much an advocate for that. About cutting specifically, I will say that for the rules we break, there's 24 exercises here. I think I probably had almost double that number, and I had to work, and I just had generated a lot. I had a lot of content. And I talked about the cup and the physical constraints. Once I started working with a book publisher, the physical constraints of the book actually really matter. Book publishers do not make a lot of money per book, believe it or not. And they're trying to, especially when, the price is $29.95. So it's not like an $80 sort of overpriced textbook. We were really trying to price it for a wider audience. So they don't have a huge profit margin. They really need to think about like for a book this size that has this is actually, I think, I don't know how many color, this might be 4 color printing or 3 color printing, 2 colors in black. But those constraints really matter. And basically the editor I was working with just said, we have to cut it down. Like, we don't have that many pages in the book. And so I worked with her and really figuring out what would make the most sense. So, and I think you're totally right, Kat, that things that you cut, like sometimes those ideas that you had, like, oh, I really wanted to hang on to this, you always will have that idea for use in another project. So that's a good approach, that you're not ever losing anything, but it's often true that less is more, that by slimming something down and making it more focused, it's going to get stronger and end up being a better experience.
Fantastic. Thank you for going into such detail about the process and the constraints. As someone like I'm totally unfamiliar with how publishing works. And so every time I hear
Oh,
anything about it, I'm like, whoa, okay, did not know that.
right.
It's always great to get that additional context.
Well,
Um,
I'm happy to talk about it more. I mean, you know, just to say very briefly, I talked about having all the exercises in a Dropbox folder that people were accessing. I actually only wrote up the proposal for a publisher after that. So that was me kind of still developing the content for the book. But at a certain point, I knew I wanted to approach publishers, and I wrote a proposal, so a book proposal, which included an outline of what this was. It included a chapter from the book, basically a sample, a small sample from the book. It included references of other books that I felt, I could compare it to, or that had already come out, and how this was sort of like them, but also offering something new. And it even had, because this is quite a visual book, in this case, it even had some visual references as well, that I had put together, and I got a lot of help from friends that are designers, on some of those things too. So, and then so that was almost like in the middle of the process. And then once I found a publisher that was interested, then I was collaborating with them on developing it further and getting it to the final form.
Fantastic. Thank you for elaborating on that.
Yeah,
To kind of zoom
but
out for one last
yeah,
question, if that's all right with you.
please, sure.
Students are interested in do you think it's better to be initially passionate about a subject or initially approaching it from a very practical standpoint? And I'll be like coming out of that question also, like, do you write about things that are very personally interesting to you, or do you kind of try to bring in elements of this is just like objectively of interest when you're thinking about a project or when you're developing a project?
That's such an interesting question. And I think that I don't think there's one answer to that question. I mean, I can talk to you a little bit about from my point of view, but um, I think that different people are going to have a different creative process and kind of a different relationship to the subjects in which they work or write about. For me, um, I a little bit want to have both sides of the equation, right? I definitely um, feel like I can only work on things that I'm really passionate about and personally interested in, and that I feel strongly about. And in the case of the rules we break, like I said, it was less of me, oh, I want to write about this new thing. And it was more, hey, I want to document the way I'm already teaching and think about how it's put together in order to try and try and make it relevant for other people. This is something that I wanted to share. Um, I I I I guess it really depends on uh I guess it would be hard for me to think about working on something that I wasn't super passionate and interested about and maybe already had a point of view. But on the other hand, I also feel like writing about something is a way of investigating it. And so, I think often people feel like, oh, I can't write about that thing because I'm not an expert on it yet, or I can't teach about it because I'm not an expert on it yet. But for me, writing and teaching are ways of like coming to know something, right? So you might say, hey, I'm going to teach a class or write a book because I want to learn more about something. Um, and I also feel that I think also part of the kind of wanting both sides of it. So it might be that, okay, maybe I don't know that much about this, but I want to know more, and that's why I'm going to do this project. I also feel that for me, the idea that I'm playtesting something, putting it in front of other people, and I'm actually going to incorporate their feedback in a meaningful way. It's not just for show. It's not just because I know it's something I'm supposed to do, but like I really might make radical or drastic changes based on what's working and what's not working. For me, that approach helps keep me honest, and it kind of keeps me from being too close to the project. Like it keeps me from being like holding it so tight like it's a baby, and I don't want anyone to give it bad feedback. Like I have to put it out there as early as possible in the process. And by doing so, um, it separates itself from me, and you end up like, I wouldn't say that I have an objective point of view, but I'm incorporating other people's points of view along with my own, and it's all going in to make the project better. So I think that again, kind of paying attention to what a project needs along the way, because like as we move from these like bigger decisions to more specific to developing and developing all the content and writing it, and then getting to the end where you're really refining and making smaller and smaller changes, like different stages along the way are going to require different kinds of thinking. And so that's, for me, that's like the really tactical part of writing or producing something, is really figuring out, okay, what does this need? Who needs to look at it? What kind of feedback do I need at this moment? And I'll just give you one more quick example of that. One of the things that I worked on, and I ended up working on it first with the editor, and then with the graphic designer, the format of the exercises. So again, this might not apply if you're just writing a book and the book is more like, just pages of text. But in this case, this is more like a recipe book. So getting down to this format, this is what an exercise looks like. And there's a lot of kind of, in this case, I think it's a few more pages. It's 3-page spreads is this exercise. And there's a lot of kind of hidden UI UX stuff here. For example, all of the black text is the actual way that you run the exercises. So this is like 2, discuss what happens, 3, adjust the system. All of the red text is like the stuff to talk about, tips for running it, discussion questions. And so if you're just trying to figure out what is this thing, you can just stick to the black text. But the purple text here is kind of like the special text. There's also other things. We spent a long time figuring out, what should this opening page look like? Like this is what you need and what you learn, because I knew that if I'm putting this, I wanted to make these browsable so that you don't have to read the whole thing and then figure out what it is. So, and I know in retrospect, it seems really easy, but all of this is like the interface to the information. There's a title, this wonderful, big, playful title. Then there's a subtitle that gives you a little more information. Then there's the what you need and what and then you're actually getting into the article. So I really, and all of those different blocks and what went where and what needed to go here, what elements need to go in front of what, and how are we going to structure that visually and organizationally. We went through many iterations. So there were at least 10 or 20 different versions of what an exercise looked like. And at one point, we just took one exercise and we were rewriting it and rewriting it and rewriting it. And then once we had that one exercise down, then we're like, okay, now we can start applying this to other exercises. So was our tactics at that point. We realized, oh, wait a second, we're in the middle of this process. There's some exercises I haven't written yet, but before I go farther, it makes sense to kind of focus on this one thing. What is the format of an exercise going to be? Okay, now we've got that figured out. Then moving forward, we're going to be a little more efficient. So all of those things then add up, like in that's the process, right? Like what you don't see those 10 or 20 iterations of the format of an exercise. All you have is the final version. But I just really want to emphasize to everyone watching that idea of a process, that idea of being hungry to change. And I think that's the hardest thing. Like you write something, you love it. I love this sentence. I love this paragraph. I love where this is going. But I think that it's really important to cultivate a kind of a hunger for critical feedback that's going to be, hard hitting, but honest. And it's going to challenge you, and it's going to force you to make what you're doing better. And so I think cultivating the taste for that sort of spicy, hard-hitting feedback uh, is really important. And I think that that's part of like you know, growing out of this phase where it's like, oh, I love it, I love my baby, and I don't want anyone to criticize it, to being like, oh no, let's, you know, let's take a magnifying glass to this, and like, I need help. Please help me make this better. You know, and I, from the reading group, I was getting brutally honest feedback about what worked and what didn't work. And uh, yes, it's hard to take that feedback sometimes, but you're so grateful for it afterwards, because it, you know, it's the only way, I feel it's the main way to make something better. And I'm so grateful to everyone that gave me feedback and help this book get better. And there's a big acknowledgments page at the end where I have a huge list of names of everyone that helped out.
That's fantastic. I know just as you're describing it, I can already kind of see how it's such an applicable skill, this desire for feedback and an ability to like reach out for it and get it and then to apply it. Like that's pretty much a universal like how to that helps everywhere. So very much
Right.
appreciate you getting into your process and really laying it all out for us, showing kind of how you're thinking about it, what your ideas are, what your kind of core values and concepts are as you approach this process. All of that, like
Right.
as a student, is just super helpful because cultivating process is pretty much what college is all about. Really,
I
very much
think
appreciate you getting into that.
I think that's so well put, Kat. And I also think that like it kind of goes back to your very first question, you know, exactly what you're talking about, cultivating an interest in process. For me, that's what I realized is one of the things that game design can help us with. Because, you know, if you take one of the exercises here, like, oh, take tic-tac-toe and let's modify it. We change some rules. How does it affect the play? But you realize you're also designing a process. We're going to actually have to experiment with this. Like we change a rule, what happens? I don't know. Let's play test it and see. Let's have others play test it, and they're going to tell us what they think. So I guess what I would say is that yes, the process of making this book definitely is you know, got into what you're talking about. But in this case, the content of the book, like what you and I have been talking about, that's also like that is specifically what a lot of these exercises are about. And what motivated me to write the book is to share these kind of techniques and lessons for doing problem solving.
Much appreciated. Thank you so much for your time and for sharing with us all these wonderful things.
Thanks, Kat. Was really a pleasure, and thanks everybody for the great questions. Um, and if you ever want to look me up, I'm at the NYU Game Center in Tisch School of the Arts on the Brooklyn campus. So maybe I'll see some of you there.
Really.
Thanks.